Today we're going to be looking at the early phases of the Civil War, focusing mainly on the conflict in Virginia and the blockade and the attempt of the North to sort of strangle the South before the war really gets started. And this is a little bit complicated because, of course, a lot of people really like the Civil War, and so I'm going to try to give you a little taste of some of the battles and strategy and just a little bit of it without getting too much into the weeds because, of course, the APUS is not a military history course, and there won't really be any military history on the test itself. But you do need to know the basic forces and the reasons why things sort of unfolded the way they did. So I'm going to try to present that in as succinct a way as possible while still giving you a little bit of a taste of what the combat was like. So the North's major strategy was, of course, because the North had so many more resources than the South, the North was going to try to starve the South out. And so what was called the Anaconda Plan was put into place. The Anaconda Plan, Winfield Scott was the general who came up with it. You may remember him as the Mexican-American War general and former presidential candidate. But the basic goal is strangle the South, blockade the coast, and then slowly squeeze inward, chopping off pieces and isolating the South until you force them to surrender. And it seems like a reasonable plan for a much more industrial, larger power to use against a geographically large but relatively smaller and weaker power. So that's the Anaconda Plan, and that was the basic strategy for over the long term. But for a lot of people, the Battle of Bull Run is the first sort of set-piece battle of the Civil War, and it's reminiscent of a lot of things that happen early on. The North has a significant material and manpower advantage, and they believe that this is all that they will need to overwhelm the South. The North also doesn't plan very well and doesn't organize very well, and so when they march south, they utterly telegraph their movements and that the Southerners basically know exactly where they are, and the Northerners take forever to get set up, allowing the Southerners to sort of dictate the battlefield to them. And the fact that it takes them forever to get where they are ready to fight means that the South is able to bring in significant reinforcements, which is a common theme throughout the early years. The North has a numerical advantage, and then they hesitate, and then the South brings in more troops, and then all of a sudden, their forces are almost even. And so the Battle of Bull Run is the first time that the Northern troops really see combat, and it really doesn't go that well. General Thomas Jackson stands like a stone wall sort of in the middle of the Southern lines, repels the Union assault, and then the Southerners, with their stereotypical rebel yell, counterattack. The Northerners are overwhelmed, and they have to retreat all the way back to Washington, D.C. And so the Battle of Bull Run is a major victory for the South, and what it demonstrates for the North is that they're not prepared for this, one. Their army is not trained at all, and that this is going to be much more challenging than simply going in and just capturing the Southern capital. And so Bull Run kicks off this massive period of mobilization in the North where they actually put together and train an army. And so Montgomery Meigs is the quartermaster of the U.S. Army, and he takes over all the logistics, and he supplies the troops, which is a major undertaking because the Union Army is going to be huge. And so he is going to get all the supplies, all the firepower, all the uniforms and all this stuff and all the food, and is going to ensure that the Union Army is well supplied, which in general the Union Army was fairly well supplied throughout the war. They're also going to create something called the Army of the Potomac, and they're going to put a guy named George McClellan in charge of it. And McClellan is a pretty good general for building armies. He puts together a pretty good officer corps. He trains his men and drills them very effectively. And he's pretty good at logistics as far as making sure that there's enough money, enough troops, enough bullets, all these things. And so on paper, McClellan is a really great general, and his troops become incredibly loyal to him. And so McClellan builds this thing called the Army of the Potomac, which over the span of months they're preparing for. And then they prepare for a second, and then the goal is to take this army and have a second assault on Virginia and again capture the capital. So the Army of the Potomac is eventually going to set out, and what they decide this time is rather than marching overland, they're going to use their naval superiority and sail up the Chesapeake Bay and then launch an attack into Virginia from the coast. And this is what's known as the Peninsular Campaign, or the Peninsula Campaign. Here's General McClellan, who is going to be the leader of this campaign. So he lands, as you can see here, on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay and then fights his way past several lines of Southern defenses. Over the span of approximately a month, he's going to fight his way all along the peninsula, and is going to be on the outskirts of Richmond. And so the first phase of the Peninsula Campaign is incredibly successful. But the problem that McClellan has is, as good as he is at logistics and as good as he is at organizing, he's actually a terrible battlefield commander. He's utterly paranoid. He's always convinced that the enemy outnumbers him. And so once he gets to Richmond and the Southerners really sort of dig in, the whole thing is going to go south for McClellan pretty quickly and pretty severely. Here's McClellan after winning a battle. Obviously, he's writing in his journal here, and you can see that, like, despite the fact that he had a 2-to-1 advantage, he thought he was significantly outnumbered, and despite the fact, and Lincoln kept encouraging him to attack and take the Southern capital, but he was, and you can see he's insulting Lincoln here in this piece. And so McClellan, what's going to start happening is McClellan's going to fight battles, he's going to win them, and then he's going to start retreating. And this happens over and over again in what's known as the 7 Days Battles, where the South counterattacks, McClellan wins the battle, the South suffers significantly more losses than the North, but afterwards McClellan becomes convinced that he's about to get surrounded and he withdraws. And so over 7 days, McClellan is going to win battle after battle, and continue to withdraw, and he was going to withdraw until he gets all the way back to the James River and then sails out of the South. And so this is sort of the hallmark of McClellan, is that despite the fact that he is a really good sort of general on paper, when he actually has to lead troops, he does a really poor job. And the Peninsular Campaign grinds to a halt, and in the end, he has to withdraw in disgrace. The Southern capital is again uncaptured, and the war is going to continue. The South then, of course, seeing an opportunity to counterattack, launches an assault into the North in order to try to decisively again win the war, maybe capture a major city like Philadelphia or maybe even Washington, D.C. And so this leads us to the Battle of Antietam. General Lee launches his assault across into Maryland, where he is met by General McClellan, who right outside at the town of Antietam. And the fighting is incredibly intense. You can click on the link to see it a little bit better. Both sides suffer tremendous casualties as they're fighting right along the bank of a river. And therefore, both sides have to try to cross the river in order to assault the other side. And so this is the single bloodiest day in American history. And in the end, Lee takes enough casualties that he is forced to withdraw. And both sides realize exactly how brutal modern warfare can be. And this is because of a couple of reasons. The most important reason is because the accuracy of rifles start to make assaulting a fortified position almost impossible. Whereas back in the Revolutionary War days, you have these muskets that are incredibly inaccurate unless you're very close. With these rifles, you can shoot accurately for a significant distance, meaning a charge over any sort of open area means your troops are just getting picked off one by one. And it really foreshadows exactly the effectiveness of defense in the First World War. Even though we don't really have effective real machine guns yet, the rifles can load quickly enough and can fire accurately enough that they function in a very similar way. So Antietam is incredibly bloody, and it's a tactical victory for the North because the South has to withdraw. This is wonderful for Lincoln because he had been waiting for some type of victory in order to launch his next phase of the war, which is something called the Emancipation Proclamation. You're probably familiar with the Emancipation Proclamation as the thing that quote-unquote freed the slaves, which is both true and misleading at the same time. Because here's your Emancipation Proclamation, signed, of course, by the President Abraham Lincoln, not by an act of Congress. And so the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves, yes, but only freed slaves in territories that were currently in rebellion. And so you can see all of the slave territories are colored in here. It freed slaves in the territories that were in the red and did not free slaves in the territories in the blue. This is for a couple different reasons. Mostly because he didn't want to stir up more trouble and resentment in sort of the border states regions. He wanted to keep them in the Union. And if he freed the slaves there, the odds of them going into rebellion and joining the Confederacy would be much higher. And there are even areas of the Confederacy where slaves were not freed. You can see that the North has already captured the port of New Orleans and has already liberated Tennessee, which we're going to talk about in a future lecture. And so those areas, slaves were not freed in. But this solved a persistent problem that the North had been dealing with. Namely, when you liberate a territory, what do you do with the slaves that were there? Because technically, under U.S. law, slaves are still considered property. And so as you go in, the Army, and of course, because the North does not recognize the independence of the South, the Army is marching through American territory, or what the North legally considers American territory, and potentially is confiscating property without due process of law, which is clearly against the Bill of Rights. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, by freeing all those slaves, affirms that they are not property, and therefore, if they flee to Union lines, they are now free, or their freedom is recognized. Technically, they were always free, of course, after the Emancipation Proclamation, but the states that are in rebellion are clearly not going to recognize that freedom because they no longer recognize the authority of the central government. And so, what we end up getting is the other effect is that now part of the Emancipation Proclamation allows African Americans and former slaves, or encourages African Americans and allows former slaves to enlist in the Army. And so this is going to, in a very real way, change the focus of the war for the North. Whereas the early years of the war, in the beginning for the North, the war the stated purpose of the war was to restore the Union and make the South recognize the supremacy of the federal government again. Whereas now with the Emancipation Proclamation, all the territory that is being freed is now the slaves in that territory are being liberated. And so for abolitionists, this makes the war about slavery as opposed to being about restoring the Union, which gives obviously the North significantly more motivation to fight. So the Emancipation Proclamation is incredibly important for a variety of reasons. Obviously, it solves the contraband problem, helps recruit free African Americans in the North, and in a very real way changes the focus of the war going forward, which is going to also stop European countries from getting involved, because there was some fear that European countries might help the South, but if the war becomes about slavery, for Europeans, that's going to end any chance of recognizing the Confederacy. So, amazing piece of political sort of maneuvering in order to help the North out. And the victory, quote unquote, at the Battle of Antietam sort of paved the way for that. And so what you start seeing is African Americans enrolling in the Union Army, of course, still discriminated against, still in sort of segregated companies led by white officers, but African Americans are going to be serving valiantly throughout the conflict, both former slaves and then, of course, free people of color. The movie Glory was always shown in my 8th grade class, I think, 8th grade history class, because it's the story of an African American company that serves with glory until they're killed. And so, large numbers of African Americans join the Union Army, fighting for freedom. We also get during this time both the North and the South passing conscription acts. Conscription is, of course, the draft, and so you get the first draft in American history for the Civil War, both in the North and the South. And this was relatively controversial. I mean, it was obvious why it had to happen because, of course, this is an incredibly deadly war, and you need to replenish your troops. And of course, people didn't necessarily want to go fight if they hadn't already volunteered, and so we're compelling them to go fight. And in the South, there was conscription sometimes by force, although generally people with property could be, or people who had a specific number of slaves, I forget exactly how many, but if you had enough slaves, you could be exempt from the draft. And so it was often sort of lower class yeoman farmers who were forced to go fight, which was somewhat controversial. And in the North, there was some prizes, there was some there was some sort of incentives to convince people to join, but for the most part, people were forced into it, and this led to draft riots. The most famous draft riot was in New York City, although there were a number of draft riots in other cities. Lincoln was viewed as a tyrant, of course, for declaring martial law to crush these draft riots. And he's also going to suspend habeas corpus and censor the press in order to sort of control propaganda for this war. And here we see Lincoln as a demon tyrant who's destroying the United States. And the draft riots in New York City specifically targeted African Americans. And so they targeted both government officials and African Americans, and they were incredibly bloody. And in the end, a Union Army company had to come in to put down the New York draft riots. And so this represents some of the divide within the country as far as support for the war. Yeah, here's the mayor's or Tammany Hall being burnt down by anti-draft forces. And here's martial law being declared in Bowling Green, which represents exactly how broad this sort of unrest was. As far as foreign policy goes, the main goal of both sides was to convince Europe of the righteousness of their cause. The South wanted to get recognition, of course, from European powers because that would provide legitimacy for their claim of independence, whereas, of course, the North wanted to prevent that from happening. The South felt like they had a relatively good shot at convincing the Europeans to join them because England was relatively dependent on the market for southern cotton, and therefore this sort of guns for cotton arrangement seemed like a natural fit. The South also would have hoped to get access to a European navy to maybe break the blockade, because of course almost the entire navy stayed loyal to the North, which was one of the huge advantages that the Union had over the Confederacy. As you can see, the effect of the blockade is going to ramp up slowly over time, where the South can sort of take the hit of not getting any imports in for a short period of time, but prices are going to continuously rise. And as the South has to print more and more money, eventually things get increasingly dire for the Confederacy. And so allowing a new, basically, avenue of supplies to come in would benefit the Confederacy greatly. The other thing that the South was trying to do was to break the Union blockade in order to basically keep European markets open and dependent. Because for the South, the worst case scenario is if they get completely cut off, then England's going to look to some place like Egypt or India for their supply of cotton, both markets that the British had been sort of building up and developing over time. The South had a number of blockade runners, these sort of low-profile ships that were relatively good at slipping in and out of the blockade. But over time, the Union Army became much more effective at sort of stopping and cutting them off. This is one of the ships that had been re-outfitted to be a blockade runner and was one of the most successful ships going through the blockade 17 different times to go to places like Cuba and then, of course, Europe in order to open or keep southern markets open. The problem for the South is over time the Union became much more effective at both stopping blockade runners and also taking out southern port cities, which would of course prevent the blockade runners from being able to dock. They developed this sort of rotating line of fire where the ships would move, targeting sort of the stationary batteries on land, while continually moving past these targets, preventing the land batteries from being able to hit the Union ships. And so there was this. So the South realized that their plan of just running the blockade was clearly not working, and so they tried to unleash their final and most important weapon. This, of course, is the famous ironclad. The southern ironclad ship, named the Virginia, it's the sort of triangular-looking one in the back, faced off against the Union ironclad ship, known as the Monitor, and they would fight this sort of indecisive battle for approximately 3 hours. The ships circled each other repeatedly, firing cannonballs into their hull with each other's hulls, but of course, because they were both clad in iron, the cannonballs were somewhat ineffective, and in the end, both ships had taken damage and ended up heading back to the ports. This was the only battle between the two ships, neither side willing to risk their ironclad ships in the future. And over time, the Union blockades simply became much more tight, and prices in the South rose, and the situation became much more dire.